organizing this really fantastic series of seminars, and we hope many people who are here tonight will come along to the others as well. So we're every Monday except the bank holiday Monday. So without further ado, I'm going to open up my or share my screen. Sorry, I'm just doing it wrong. I will do it correctly now. I forgot I had the slideshow open. Okay. So the title of my talk is Promoting Positive Wellbeing in Young People, and I'm focusing particularly on adolescence, as you know. I'm going to say a little bit about adolescent development in this because I think it's very important that we have a context before saying anything else about adolescence. I'm going to talk a little bit about the risks associated with adolescence, the kinds of challenges that adolescents face, and then give some general principles on supporting well-being through parenting, and some suggestions and tips that I hope some people may find useful. And then, as Daronia said, we'll finish with a few minutes of a Q&A. So in terms of defining adolescence, I think it's important to emphasize that adolescence has both the biological, the cognitive, and the social elements to it. So adolescence is that time, or has been defined in various ways, but it's typically now seen as the time between puberty or the onset of sexual maturity and independence from parents in some format. So living independently from home, being able to make independent decisions. So that means that adolescence is defined and changes, morphs from generation to generation. And indeed, you'll see that many publishing today would argue that adolescence goes up to the mid-20s because there is a prolonged dependence on parents as young people's education is now going on typically for a bit longer. As I said, I'd talk a little bit about developmental psychology. And so here I want to emphasize four things: the physical changes associated with adolescence, the cognitive or the reasoning changes associated with adolescence, the emotional changes, growing emotional autonomy, and then that kind of external social roles, how the world treats you as an adolescent. So I have one slide on each of these, and I'll say a little bit about each of them. So I suppose the most obvious initial outward sign of adolescence is the onset of puberty with growth. So typically over middle childhood, growth is not very quick. Kids grow, obviously, year to year, but suddenly in adolescence, the rate of growth changes dramatically. So we'll see that there are other changes going with that. So it's not just height, it's also deepening of the voice, increasing muscle mass. That happens in boys and girls, probably more obviously in boys initially. Development of secondary sexual characteristics, so pubic hair, breast growth in girls, and so on. The physical changes typically take place in a kind of 3 to 5 year time span in a fairly predictable sequence. Now, I'm a psychologist, not a physiologist. So my interest here is in thinking about what it means to be living in a body that is changing so quickly. And I don't think we should underestimate how dramatic those changes are for the person who's going through them. I think as the parent of an adolescent, you are most likely many years removed from when you yourself were an adolescent. And so it's important to remember that these changes are very real, they are very dramatic, and therefore it's not surprising that just thinking about these changes to your own body is a dramatic thing for a young person to do. In terms of cognitive changes, the advances in reasoning ability include changes in the ability to think logically, to think systematically, in other words, to work your way through different potential causes of a situation or to consider different solutions. And then the ability to think abstractly, to consider more abstract ideas. Now, it's not suddenly at adolescence, you are all, after adolescence, you're always thinking logically, systematically, and abstractly, of course not. But we typically see those as the highest level of achievement, and that typically before adolescence, you're not capable of such levels of logic or systematic thinking or abstract. And that's important as well, because it means you're thinking through problems in a different way, not just problems that you confront in school, but you can think about your family in different ways as well. So it brings with it a different series of thought processes, a different way of looking at the world. Adolescence also has growing emotional autonomy. So before adolescence, typically the family is the source of almost all emotional support. And by that I include the wider family, including grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles and so on. Adolescence, at least in part because of those changed thinking abilities, you can begin to see your family as not the only way that a family can be. The other families, you begin to notice, interact with one another differently. Maybe you see other people as, you know, being better than your parents at some things. And so suddenly parents who go from being the very best in the world, the people that you look up to most, may become much more perceived as fallible, as having you know, their feet on the ground, and that can be quite a significant challenge, because that can change the relationship between the young person and their parent. Emotional autonomy also means an increasing ability to work things out for yourself, not always trying to solve academic or social or other problems by reference to your parents. It means that you're beginning to become an individual, still obviously within a family, but to see it as important that you are seen as not only being defined by your family, but also defined by maybe your interests, by your other friendships, by other activities that you like to engage in. And that's, again, that's very important. It's a training ground for adult individuality and being able to engage with the world in a more adult-like way. And so, but again, it means that there is that slight moving away from the family in terms of your interests. And as well, that also means that if you're within the peer group, adolescence is very typically seen as a time when it's very important to establish and maintain peer relationships, because they're so important for social support. So that can mean that you may turn to your peers for some to support you if you're feeling down, or you may turn to them for people to go out with, to spend time with, to go to the pictures with. So that's an important source of support for young people. Changes in social roles are important to mention as well. So all of the other changes I've spoken about are really coming from within the young person themselves. So the changes in thinking and emotional reactions and autonomy and so on. But I think it's also worthwhile noticing that society and communities typically respond differently to children and to teenagers. So I'll mention that in the second point here, but the very first point to note in terms of changing social roles is that adolescence is the first time when you may have community-based roles that are not embedded within your family. So in other words, possibly a part-time job or doing some volunteering. So engaging with the outside world as an individual rather than as simply part of your family. In terms of, so that brings you more out into the community, it brings you out into the community with your peer group. But of course, we know that very often, teenagers and adolescents do not get great press in the media. They can be blamed for things. I think this is a nice example of the kind of or it's a good illustration of this, I suppose, is the way in which people have responded to teenagers over the course of the lockdown, the way in which some media outlets have focused on the times when there have been young people gathering in groups and not socially distanced, or parties in colleges, or and so on. And I think it's important to note that those throughout there were groups, my apologies, the phone is going on in the background. I hope they will soon weary of trying to get through to me. Society responds more positively to children, and so teenagers may find that if they're hanging out with a group of friends, they may be looked at more suspiciously than they would have experienced as children, when almost certainly there was a much more positive attitude towards them. And the third point I want to make here is about being responded to as a sexually mature person. Now, I am not referring here to child abuse or anything like that. I'm simply saying that adults react differently to you when you are more like an adult. And that is perceptible, even if it's quite a slight change, and that can be embarrassing. You may get looked at for longer. Some people react to that very positively, but some young people react to it with concern, with not knowing how to respond. So we need to be aware that these changing social roles are simply another change that young people have to contend with as they go through adolescence. It's probably not surprising, therefore, that we see some age-related changes in feelings of competence over the course of adolescence. I'm not filling this talk with lots of slides, but I thought that this slide and the next slide nicely illustrate, because they're showing a downward slope on two graphs. So here you're seeing how young people rated their own personal competence from first year through to sixth year. So this is not a longitudinal study. We're not talking about the same young people here. We're talking about a cross section of young people, and you'll see that in each case the direction is downward. The absolute sense of direction is bigger there for girls and for boys, but it's still downward, suggesting that in the main, young people go through adolescence gradually decreasing their sense of competence. As I say, in part because of the many changes they're trying to deal with. And that's taken from the My World survey too, which is a very large sample of secondary school pupils in Ireland. This slide taken from the same source, but again, just to note to you that, again, self-esteem is typically on a downward trajectory over the course of secondary schooling. So again, just to bear in mind that this is what young people are contending with, and what that may mean for their engagement with the rest of the world. In the context of COVID, I just wanted to point out here that young people have typically said that the way in which they cope with with stress is with friends, with music, and with sport. Or those are the three main ways in which they say they've coped with stress. Bear in mind that over the course of lockdown, their ability to engage with friends and their ability to engage in sport has very often been significantly restricted. So it's important to keep in mind that that has been an added challenge for young people over the course of the last year. And if you want to find out what young people are thinking, I would recommend this lovely report from the Department of Children and Youth Affairs and Spunout, spunout.ie, which is the youth information website. They did a survey of young people in June and July of last year. And what they found was the things that were most missing for young people, the thing that they missed most was their friends. So again, confirming the importance of the peer group for adolescents. So I suppose to this point, I've said that adolescence is a time of change, and I've tried to document the changes or some of the changes that young people are facing, just to give you, I suppose, to remind you of how much is going on for young people. And I've highlighted that we can see from lots of studies in Ireland that there is a downward trajectory of self-esteem, a downward trajectory of feelings of competence over the course of the years of secondary school. So that's showing us that young people are finding it challenging as they move from the childhood that they're leaving behind into the adulthood that is coming in their future. And what I want to highlight is that there are, in trying to navigate that transition, there are several risks that we know that young people face. And I just want to highlight these. I don't want to, not by way of being scary about them, but just to say that these are typically the kinds of challenges that are difficult in making a smooth transition from childhood into adulthood. So most of you probably are aware of the risky decision making in adolescence as a concern for parents and for the teachers and the wider community. We understand this a lot better now that we're with evidence from neuropsychology, which has been looking at the rate at which the brain matures. And what this is demonstrating is that those parts of the brain, so in particular the prefrontal cortex, which is really the seat of rational decision making, while that begins to start to operate and to guide activity at the onset of adolescence or with the arrival of puberty, it really is not fully mature until 25 years. So that's showing us that the brain itself is slow to mature, and that maturity is happening gradually, but is not complete until the mid-20s. We see the behavioral consequence of that in experimental studies that have looked at the kinds of decisions that young people make, and we see definitely that when you compare adolescents who are engaged in activities on their own versus in peers, we see that the presence of peers tends to exacerbate risky decision making. So these are simulated driving tasks, and you can safely measure the decision making of young people. And what you find is that they will take far fewer risks when they're on their own versus when they're with a group of peers. So again, the peer group can be a challenge to decision making in adolescence. There's also some evidence that rewards, and particularly short-term rewards or short-term gain, may be more salient for adolescents than they are for adults. And again, this can lead to the prioritization of very short-term decision-making. So decision-making on what am I going to enjoy doing tonight, rather than what are the likely long-term consequences of that going to be. And so part of the role of parents over the course of adolescence is to help to facilitate the move away from that to a longer term focus in terms of decision making. Linked to that is the notion of postponing gratification. So this is putting off doing something for because something will turn out better if you've put it off for a while. So putting off going to the party because studying for the exam may be more important. Now, of course, this varies hugely from one person to another, and most people, vary in their how good they are at putting off getting rewards for themselves. But nonetheless, in the main, we would see adolescents as not being as good at postponing gratification as adults. Again, at least in part because there tends to be more of a focus on short-term gain rather than long-term gain over the course of adolescence. The other risk, I suppose I'm calling it for adolescents, is that I've said how important the peer group is for young people, and that's absolutely the case. You're trying to get emotional support from them. You want your social life to be engaged with your peers. But just bear in mind that peer group that you are trying to get emotional support from, that you're engaging with and looking to develop long-term friendships with, they're going through exactly the same things that you're going through. So they're also facing the challenges that you're facing. And so the kind of support you'll get may be patchy. There may be hurtful decisions made. Everybody is learning. All of the young person's peers are going through the same as they're going through over the course of adolescence. And so that can lead to difficulties where you get let down by your peers, where somebody doesn't make a very good decision and a lot go along with that poor decision. So this is a time when the young person needs support in terms of establishing those supportive peer relationships. And at least in part, many of those challenges feed into the fact that we know that many of, or in fact, the great majority of lifetime mental health problems will first emerge over the course of adolescence. So again, my apologies, this is a rather busy looking graph, but you can ignore the red bars. The red bars are showing rates of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. What I want to focus on are the blue bars and the blue and gray. So the higher blue bar there is showing mental and substance use disorders. And you can see there that they are rising gradually over the course of adolescence into the early 20s and then declining. Self-harm has a similar trajectory, although it's tending to peak that maybe a little bit earlier, or to rise a bit more steeply early on. So it's not surprising that you get this peak in mental health challenges in adolescence, because, as I've said, adolescence is very complex. It's complex physically and neurologically, it's complex socially, it's complex cognitively, it's complex emotionally. I mean, in terms of mental health challenges, what I would like to just highlight for you is that regardless of how serious the mental health challenge a young person is facing, it is always the case that looking for help and getting help will almost always really produce a better outcome than waiting to until a problem has become more deeply rooted and established. The majority of difficulties that young people face with their mental health will go on to either disappear completely or to be much more readily managed over the course of early adulthood and into adult life. So, taken together, those the challenges and the risks, I'm arguing, give rise to a need for a very different approach to parenting over the course of adolescence. So in childhood, there was one way of parenting. In adolescence, that needs to be augmented in other ways in order to try to foster the very best possible outcome for young people. And that's now what I'd like to turn to and to mention some pointers from the research. So the first thing I'm going to emphasize from the new, what I'm calling a new parenting approach, all I mean by that is, simply slightly different parenting in adolescence as opposed to childhood, rather than any mega new invention that I have. So going back to my first slide, one of the first slides, looking at what adolescence is or how it's defined, it is all about growing independence. So therefore, it's most important that the focus of parenting in adolescence is about fostering and encouraging independence, while at the same time maintaining consistent control. And of course, that's a very difficult balance to achieve. So I will give some suggestions as to how to go about thinking about that. Encouraging the development of critical thinking skills and independent judgment. So each time there's a rush to judgment or a rush to a decision by a young person, what a parent can do is remind them that they are about potential longer term consequences, encouraging them to think in a different way, to think about longer term outcomes, to think about who else is going to be affected by the decisions that they're likely to make. This won't, this is not a miracle cure, but at the same time, you can get into a pattern of reminding, encouraging a particular way of thinking that's not only focused on the here and now, on the short-term benefit of what they're of the decision that they want to make. What a lot of parents can find challenging, I think, is the development of personal identity, although I think maybe parents have become better at this now than many generations ago, is allowing that personal identity development, particularly when it has no particularly negative consequences. So changes in hairstyle, changes in how you dress, changes in music taste, or doing things that other members of the family are not interested in doing. So allowing and understanding that as the beginnings of an expression of the need to be seen as an individual as well as a member of the family. And as I say, the prior to adolescence, that emphasis on feeling myself to be an individual is really not one that has come to the fore. Identity is typically not thought of very much by younger children. So trying to facilitate and encourage a sense of personal identity insofar as it's not a threat to anybody else or not doing any harm. Many of you probably know that the typical catchphrase for parenting, well, throughout the course of life, but maybe particularly in adolescence, is authoritative parenting. So the idea that you are responsive to a young person, but also demanding of them. So this is not expecting perfect behavior, not expecting perfect exam results, but expecting that people do their best, and so on. So it's setting a standard that is achievable, while also being forgiving when things fall short of that. So being responsive and understanding that different children will and different adolescents will achieve their goals at different rates, and being responding to that. So how can we facilitate and encourage independence? So I want to go through, I've got one slide for each of these, the communication, the self-esteem, and the decision making. So firstly, good communication. I really can't emphasize the importance of good communication in adolescence. It means everything to be able to have a good line of communication with adolescents. And I would say the starting point for that is you have to have something to communicate about. So obviously there will be the mundane day-to-day things about school, about home, about activities. But if at all possible, try to find something else that you can communicate. Take an interest in their hobbies and activities, no matter how different they are from the things that you are interested in. Find activities that you can do together in ways that allow the young person to feel that they are being listened to, that their specific interests are being taken account of. So if you have something that you can talk about, if you can find time each day to have a conversation, I haven't put this into the list of things here, but what I would advise, I think I've always found, or when my own son was a teenager, I found it great to go for a walk with him, or to talk to him when we were driving in the car. There's something much less threatening about having conversations when you're beside somebody rather than facing them. So I would strongly encourage looking at that to find a way into having chats and being able to keep that channel of communication open. The second point I want to make here, or a suggestion I want to make, is always try to keep your cool, regardless of how outlandish a suggestion or a proposal a young person makes is. Firstly, they may be testing you. They may be looking to see how you will react. So rather than, reacting with horror or, really blowing up, being able to take a step back and to ask them to pause and to reflect on what they're doing. So these phrases, things like, I understand why you think that, but that's not what I found, or that's interesting. Have you thought of what it might mean for this? Or, if you're going to go out tonight, how do you think that will impact on your exam tomorrow? Or do you think you'll be able to get up in time to make the bus, or whatever it is? So that, to try always to kind of offer an alternative to the decision that they're making that you have concerns about, to get them to see it in a different way. I would also suggest clear directions or instructions. So hints often don't work so well in adolescence. So try to be clear and try to give a reason for why you want them to do something. So, could you, if it's their job to cut the grass, could you cut the grass because if it grows any longer, the lawnmower won't be able to cope with it. That you're giving a reason for why you're asking them to do something, rather than them believing that they're being asked to do something simply for the sake of it. So that there's a rationale for why they are being asked to do certain things. Try to find ways to enhance self-esteem. So I really would not be, I wouldn't hold back on praising young people. I think that it's really important, if they've done something that you really wanted them to do, thank them, tell them how proud you are, say to them how important it was to you, or point out nice things that they've done. Oh, your brother was delighted with that present. It was really thoughtful of you, or it was really nice of you to invite that friend out. I know you were, concerned about them. Just to highlight the things that they've done, that you feel proud that they have done. And all of those things will help to enhance their self-esteem. And remember again, that graph which showed self-esteem potentially being on a downward trajectory. I think, from looking from midlife, looking at adolescence and the obsession with appearance can look extremely narcissistic. But remember what I said about how rapidly the body is changing in adolescence. Allowing that obsession with appearance and not commenting on it, particularly not reacting negatively to it. If possible, just let it go. It is natural. If you're changing really quickly, if something really significant is happening to you, then it's quite a natural thing to obsess about it. So try to be accepting of that, because, as I say, their self-esteem is likely to be on a downward trajectory anyway. One of the things I think that can be very good for self-esteem in adolescence is recognizing a growing expertise. So if you have an adolescent who's getting better at sports or whatever hobby they have, you know, whatever they're enjoying and engaging in, recognizing how good they are at that, and telling them that that makes you proud. It's you know, just acknowledging them for what they're doing, particularly if it's something that you're not mad about, because that will make them feel all the better, that you're acknowledging that they're really good at sport when you're not a particularly sporty person, or you're not that interested in it, or if you are a sporty person and they're interested in film or music or something. Acknowledging that and recognizing that is really important. Try always to see what you can do to help and enhance self-esteem. Encouraging responsible decision making. I mean, again, there isn't any quick fix here, but typically the advice would be to encourage what people are calling regulated independence. So in other words, allow as much independence as possible when the stakes are low. So if no mega negative consequence is likely from a decision that's being made, then let the young person make it, even if you think it is a mistake. The way we learn is to make mistakes. So if at all possible, try to allow decision making independently when the stakes are low. Try not to use scare tactics. In other words, try not to exaggerate what the negative consequence of a behavior will be, where that's not realistic. So, you know, if you're somebody hasn't done their maths homework tonight in 5th year, and you start invoking the Leaving Cert and telling them that if they go on like this, they're going to fail the Leaving Cert, or they won't get into college, or if they don't go to training tonight, that they definitely won't make the team. That's not particularly helpful. It's very unlikely that any one event is going to have such negative consequences. So try to be measured, try to give a proportionate response to any behavior that's suggested, or any decisions that are made. Do always ask to be told where they're going, who they're with, and to inform you at once of any change of plans. So there is evidence that even when, and I mean, we know now with mobile phones, you may not always be told 100% the truth about where they're going, but the very act of asking for the information, thanking them when they give the information, and I always said a thank you when a late night phone call came in to tell me that there'd been a change of plan and they were going to be later than they'd said, or whatever. Just to know that just keeping those tabs, it does seem to reduce levels of risky behavior over time. So that is really a useful thing to do, and it keeps you, you know, it allows you to know where the young person is. Some further suggestions, where, you know, most of the time when young people are talking about decisions they're making, or ideas they have, or attitudes they have developed, they're unlikely to be very extreme. So try wherever possible to be open-minded, non-judgmental, and simply to encourage broader thinking. So to question them about what that means for them, for other people, and so on. I have found that humor can work very well with adolescents, that trying to keep the tone of engagement a little bit lighter can often help, rather than allowing things to become extremely fraught and emotions to get heated. Being able to find something to laugh at can very often help to lighten a situation, and can diffuse a growing tension. So I would definitely consider your line and jokes, particularly if you yourself are the butt of them, because an adolescent is likely to find that quite funny. encouraging them to think more widely. I think one of the challenges in adolescence is that tendency to focus in just on yourself and your own little world. To encourage them to think more broadly, to think about what's going on around them in the community and so on. Now, you know, when they're in the middle of making a decision, that can be hard, but in general, to encourage a thinking about what else is going on in the world, so that they see that they are part of a not just a family, but a community of a wider world, and that indeed in Ireland in the 21st century, more people are would probably in general doing better than many other parts of the world. This is really my final slide with any substance on it. And I just really want to say that I think you should apply this compassion to yourself as well as to the young person. And indeed, our final talk in this series is on about compassion in dealings with young people, encouraging young people to not to be too hard on themselves. When you are the parent of a teenager, you can very often be reminded of the feelings that you yourself had when you were a teenager, and that can be difficult to deal with. It may also mean that you sometimes jump to inappropriate conclusions. So you may conclude that your adolescent is thinking exactly as you were when you were their age. They may be not at all. So just be cautious not to jump to conclusions because of your own experiences in adolescence. The other thing that can happen is, as teenagers become more adult-like in appearance, and their behavior is more adult-like, what can happen is you can begin to see family resemblances. So most of those are going to be purely benign. You look like your granddad, or you have a beautiful voice like your Auntie Mary. But there can also be, oh my God, you're reminding me of that obnoxious cousin Joe that I have, or whatever. Just be cautious about that. It's not, there's nothing you can do about it, but just to keep in mind that may be something that is influencing your reactions to them. So just be cautious that you are responding to the adolescent and not to your worries that they're suddenly becoming like somebody else that you would rather they did not become like. The third point here is adolescents can be quite come across as quite negative about their parents. This is very natural. The argument would be that in forging an identity, adolescents first decide what they're not rather than what they are, and sometimes what you're not or what you don't want to be is like is like your parent. So you may be they may be reacting against you. So be kind to yourself, find something positive to do for yourself. Don't let that get to you. Talk to your friends about it, particularly friends that have got other, the other friends that have got teenage kids. So that is important, be kind to yourself. If you've had a hard time and an argument over something, do something to reward yourself for having got through it. And then the final point here is just to keep in mind that you can't be a perfect parent. There is no such thing as a perfect parent. What you are, you will get very annoyed. You will behave in a way that you afterwards think, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. That is just part of being human. So forgive yourself those things. What you're aiming for is an over time consistency, and over time encouragement of independence, and over time reasoned approach, building communication over time. From day to day, there will be fluctuations, there will be good days and bad days. So again, please do think about yourself in all of this, and think about caring for yourself, because you can't be a good parent to your adolescent unless you look after yourself as well. And so I think that I'm going now to a slide that just says, thank you, yes. And so I also put in this nice little quotation here from Mark Twain that I quite liked, that when I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant, I could hardly bear to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished how much he'd learned in 7 years. So, you know, adolescents do change. They do typically end up with good working relationships and good family relationships, so that will you will come around to that. Now I'm going to move into a question and answer session now. So, but I just wanted to tell you a little bit about some work that Daronia is doing with me, and that's a study which is looking at parents of adolescents. We're particularly interested in issues around your reactions to the kind of mental health challenges that young people may face. We've got a very good response to this, so we're clearly tapping into an interest of parents and a concern of parents. So we've got over 700 parents have responded already, but we are looking for a really nice large sample of parents. We'd encourage you all, please, if you have time, think about filling it in. In fact, you can scan this QR code now and get straight into the survey, particularly to encourage dads. We find in all our research that mums tend to be quicker to fill things in rather than dads. So any dads who are listening, we would really appreciate your help. Please do consider doing this. It takes, Daronia, what would you say, about 12 minutes to fill in the survey?
10 to 12 minutes.
Cool. Okay. So yeah. So okay, we can maybe move on to Q&A. I'm going to leave that slide up, if that's okay with people, just so that just to remind people about the study. So Daronia, I think you were going to keep an eye on any of the questions that were coming in.
Yes. So here's the first question for you, Eilis. What is a good response to teens when they feel you're out of touch with their interests, especially for the older parent?
Yeah, so I mean, it's nearly always going to be the case that you are out of touch, because things change from generation to generation. I would advise you to try to find out more, sound interested. If your son or daughter has some new thing that you don't know anything about, so they like to play a particular video game, say, and if you're, my age or even up to 10 years younger than me, you did not grow up with video games. So find out, ask some questions about it. You won't necessarily be greeted with warmth initially on that, but just even showing an interest in it, and asking them to tell you about it. So use it as a way to start a conversation in order to keep open a channel of communication. That would be my main advice.
Thanks, Eilis. And another question here is, in general, do boys mature differently and later than girls?
So now this is an interesting question. I've read about this over the years. I believe, from what I have seen, from the kind of physiological change, yes, boys are slightly slower than girls. So girls tend to reach puberty before boys, but it's only 6 months is the average difference. What does happen, that there is a difference in the growth spurt. So girls tend to have an earlier and a sharper growth spurt. So in other words, girls are younger when they first show that adolescent growth spurt, and it tends to be quite sharp, but then to end. So they will reach their full adult height when quite young. Whereas what happens with boys is that it tends to be slightly slower and goes on for longer. And it's actually that the lengthening of the growth spurt that is argued that means that boys are taller than girls by the end of adolescence. So yes, there are differences, but not probably as dramatic as people think, because it's just sometimes the change in body shape in girls is more obvious, and so that you see that, and then you think, oh, girls are way ahead of boys. I believe it's 6 months is the average difference.
And Eilis, is there a difference in how boys or girls rate their competencies in mixed sex versus single sex schools? Do you know? I think that's going back to the My World finding.
Yes. So I've never seen evidence of this. I'm sure there are differences, but I haven't seen those differences in boys and girls. Differences in self-esteem tend to be universal. I've never seen anything that has demonstrated differences between single sex and co-ed schools. There may be other differences though. So what psychologists will often measure are, as I showed you from the My World survey, self-esteem and competence. But that doesn't mean that in some kind of day-to-day interactions, that being in a co-ed school, you may feel more comfortable with people of the opposite sex, and so on. So there can be other subtle differences, but sometimes those things are not the things that are measured by psychologists. So what I'm saying is, I don't know of anything that has been measured that's showing a big difference. But on the other hand, it may be that we're not measuring the things where there is difference.
If anyone else has any other questions, you can pop them in the chat or the Q&A there. We probably have time for 1 or 2 more.
I'm seeing something in the chat there. Or something in more? Is that significant? I'm seeing 21 somethings there, Dorania. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, no, that's just different comments.
That's just different comments. Okay.
I noticed that 2 people have raised their hands, but if possible, if you have a question, to pop it into the chat or the Q&A.
Apologies. I accidentally hit on sorry, I'm having problems with getting my slide to re-show as a slide. Well, I think, do I see one thing in the Q&A there, Dorania? Is there
just a comment? Oh, we have a question here. In relation to knowing when a child might need outside help, what would be the signs?
So, well, Dorania, you may want to come in on this here. I mean, this is always very, very challenging to know what to do. The signs will be different. So in other words, depending on what's going on for the young person, the sign will be quite different. So very often a rule of thumb, actually, I'll stop sharing since very often a rule of thumb is that if you find that you can no longer carry out your normal everyday activities because of the distress or the upset or the behavior of the young person, then that is typically a time to seek help. So if you find yourself not doing things because you're concerned about how they will react in public, or that they're no longer willing to do things, and that I would say is probably about the only kind of generic statement I could make about to know when to seek help. Dorania, would you have anything you would add?
Yeah, I suppose one thing I'd say too is, sometimes in the early stages when an adolescent is experiencing distress, what we see is that the symptoms don't always mimic what you would typically see or typically think is a mental health difficulty. Like very often in the early stages, it's almost like typical adolescent behavior, and it can be very difficult for parents to determine, should I get help or not. But I think the most important thing, as a parent, is to know your own child, to know when their behavior is different from what you'd normally see. And I think sometimes there's no harm checking out, or talking to your GP, or talking, there's services like Jigsaw, just to go and see, if the adolescent needs to talk to someone about how they're feeling.
Yeah, very good advice.
So one more question here. Can you say something about sibling rivalry, especially when there's a big age gap? How would you handle that?
Yeah, so sibling relationships are they're both the most siblings are both the most wonderful relationships you can have, and the ones, you know, they're, when you think about it, they're the relationships we have for the longest in our lives. Rivalry is common. Uh, what I would say is, if you could try to see what the source of that is it that one sibling is getting more attention, or is perceived to be getting more attention, which can often be the thing, you know, you know, you think of the stereotype of the new baby coming home, and the other siblings, or one other sibling being upset because now the baby's getting more attention. To try, where possible, if it is about attention, then to see if you can give some time to the sibling who is feeling put out, to help them feel that they are also valued. If it's about a kind of a jealousy, like, you know, you're better, you know, you're a better sportsman than I am, then maybe to help the sibling who's not so good at that to find the thing that they're good at, and to be able to develop their competence in that new area, so they're not rivals within the same area. But unfortunately, I don't have any you know, quick, there's not an easy resolution to that. It is something that sibling rivalry and jealousy and so on, it is a fact of life. And but as I say, just try those, see if giving additional attention or support or encouraging new areas of skill might help.
I think unfortunately we're running out of time, but just to say thank you so much to Eilis for a really informative talk. And to say that our next talk, which will be looking at managing school stress, will be on the 10th of May. And I'd encourage you all to sign up. It'll be really interesting too.
And thanks to Dorania for putting this series of talks together. And Anya, thank you very much for being along in order to offer some additional technical support to us both. So thank you all, and I hope that you'll come along and join us it'll be 2 weeks' time. Okay, goodbye everybody.